Hey, sleepy little aristocrat. Still awake? Take a little breath, get comfortable, and forget about the outside world for a while. Because tonight, we're opening the doors to the secret lives of rich Victorian women and the things they never told their husbands. Now, before we start imagining every rich Victorian woman secretly living a double life behind a velvet curtain, let's talk about the thing that controlled almost everything else: marriage. Because for wealthy Victorian families, marriage wasn't always about finding someone you loved. Sometimes it was about finding someone who was useful. Useful financially, useful socially, useful politically. Useful for the family name, and preferably rich enough that nobody had to pretend otherwise. A young woman from a wealthy family could grow up knowing that, eventually, she was expected to marry. Not just any man, a suitable man. And suitable could mean a remarkable number of things. He needed the right family, the right connections, the right income, the right reputation, the right religion. And ideally, he wouldn't be completely unbearable to spend the rest of your life with. That last requirement was apparently negotiable, because romance was lovely, obviously. But families had bills, and estates, and inheritances, and social positions to maintain. Nobody wanted their daughter coming home one afternoon and announcing, "Good news, everyone, I've fallen madly in love. Wonderful." Who is he? Well, is he wealthy? No. Does his family have a title? No. Does he own property? Not really. Excellent. We have made a terrible mistake. Now, this doesn't mean Victorian marriages were universally miserable. Far from it. Some couples genuinely loved each other. Some became close friends. Some had deeply affectionate marriages. But the important thing is that a wealthy woman's marriage could involve much more than her personal feelings. It connected two families. It could affect inheritance. It could affect property. It could affect social standing. And once the marriage happened, there was another enormous expectation waiting for her. Be a good wife. And being a good wife involved considerably more than being nice to your husband. She was expected to help manage the household, organize servants, raise children, maintain social connections, host guests, remember birthdays, write letters, attend dinners, visit relatives, keep track of household matters, and somehow remain elegant while doing all of this. Because apparently looking exhausted was socially unacceptable when you're wealthy. The richer the household, the more complicated this could become. A large Victorian home could have a whole army of servants: cook, housemaid, lady's maid, footman, butler, nursemaid, governess, gardener, and sometimes even more. Which meant the wife could become the unofficial manager of a small private corporation, except nobody was calling it a corporation. They called it running the household. And if something went wrong, somehow it was still her problem. The cook wasn't getting along with the housemaid? Her problem. The children were misbehaving? Her problem. A dinner guest complained? Her problem. The servants were stealing food? Her problem. The husband came home in a bad mood because something happened at work? Well, probably also her problem. So there was an enormous amount of invisible labor happening behind the scenes, and much of it was expected to look effortless. A wealthy Victorian woman wasn't supposed to announce, "I have spent 6 hours today dealing with household disasters." She was supposed to appear at dinner looking perfectly composed, hair done, dress arranged, expression pleasant, as if she had spent the afternoon floating around the house on a cloud. Meanwhile, somewhere behind her, a maid was probably having a nervous breakdown over the laundry. And this is where the idea of private versus public life becomes extremely important. Because a woman could behave one way in public and completely differently in private. In front of guests, she might be gracious. In front of relatives, polite. In front of her husband, composed. But behind a closed door? That was where the real opinions could come out. And wealthy Victorian women had plenty of opinions. They could dislike their husband's friends. They could resent their in-laws. They could hate certain social obligations. They could think a dinner guest was unbearably pretentious. They could be furious about household spending. They could be annoyed with their husband's decisions. And they could complain about all of it, just usually not where everyone could hear. Because Victorian society was obsessed with respectability. And respectability wasn't simply about being morally good. It was about appearing morally good. There is a difference, a very important difference. You could be furious. Just don't look furious. You could dislike someone. Just don't embarrass them publicly. You could be unhappy in your marriage. Just don't make it obvious. You could have problems. Just make sure the curtains are closed before anyone sees them. The house itself almost became part of the performance. Everything had to communicate success. The furniture, the clothes, the dinner, the servants, the children's behavior, even the way guests were received. And if something was going wrong, you hid it. Because admitting that the household wasn't perfect could damage the family's reputation. This is why the wealthy Victorian woman's private correspondence is so interesting. A diary might contain something completely different from the polished version of her life. A letter to a close friend could suddenly become brutally honest. The woman who spent the afternoon smiling politely could sit down at night and write several pages explaining exactly how irritating everyone had been. And sometimes the husband was the person she was writing about. Not necessarily because she hated him. Sometimes she loved him. Sometimes she was worried about him. Sometimes she was simply frustrated. But the private version of the relationship could be much more complicated than the public version. And there was another reason women sometimes kept things from their husbands: money. Now, this is where things get especially interesting. Because when you imagine a wealthy Victorian woman, you might assume money wasn't a problem. After all, she's rich. She has a mansion. She has servants. She probably owns more silverware than an entire village. What could she possibly need money for? Well, quite a lot, actually. And depending on the circumstances, she might not have complete control over the money attached to her marriage or family. A wealthy woman could have an allowance. She could receive money from family. She could have inherited property or investments. She could have personal spending money. And she could become very skilled at managing it. But the details of who legally controlled what could vary enormously depending on the period, marriage arrangements, inheritance, and the laws involved. And that matters. Because the phrase rich Victorian woman makes it sound like wealth automatically meant independence. It didn't. A woman could live in an enormous house without having the same control over its finances as the man who owned it. She could wear an extraordinarily expensive dress without being the person who decided whether the money should be spent. And she could have access to luxury while still having to negotiate for certain things. Which brings us to one of the most interesting parts of wealthy women's private lives: the allowance. An allowance could give a wife a degree of personal financial freedom. She could use it for clothing, gifts, charity, personal expenses, servants, social obligations, and occasionally things she didn't particularly want her husband asking too many questions about. Because once you give someone money and tell them it's theirs to spend, you've created a tiny private economy. And wealthy Victorian women could become remarkably skilled at operating inside it. They knew what things cost. They knew which shops were expensive. They knew which expenses could be explained. They knew which purchases were socially necessary. And they knew when something could simply be described as household expenses and left at that. Now imagine the husband asking, "Darling, how much did that cost?" And the wife smiling politely, "Oh, nothing terribly important," which, translated from Victorian wife into modern language, means you do not need to know. And sometimes, he probably didn't. Because the more complicated a household became, the more difficult it was for one person to know everything happening inside it. There were servants, invoices, suppliers, bills, clothing, food, travel, children, guests, repairs, gifts, charity, and an endless stream of little expenses. So the household could become a place where information was constantly moving, and women were often right in the center of that system. They knew who had been paid, who hadn't, what needed replacing, who had been invited, who had offended whom, who was sick, who was pregnant, who was getting married, who was having financial problems, and, perhaps most importantly, who was talking about whom. Because if there was one thing Victorian society had in abundance, it wasn't electricity. It was gossip. And wealthy women had access to some of the best gossip in the entire house. The maid knew what the mistress had been doing. The lady's maid knew what she was wearing. The nursemaid knew what the children had been saying. The cook knew what food had disappeared. And the wife probably knew more about the servants than her husband did. So while the husband might believe he was the great commander of the household, there was a very good chance his wife had the intelligence network. And she wasn't even wearing a uniform. But money wasn't the only thing women could keep quiet about. Because eventually, every wealthy Victorian marriage ran into another subject that was considerably harder to discuss: the bedroom. And this is where Victorian respectability gets especially complicated. Because people often imagine Victorian society as completely prudish, as if nobody knew what sex was, as if married couples simply shook hands before going to sleep. Obviously, that's nonsense. Victorian people had sex. Married couples had sex. They had children. They discussed sexual health. Doctors wrote about sexual behavior. And women certainly had their own experiences, desires, frustrations, and fears. They just didn't necessarily have the freedom to discuss them openly. And some of the things women privately thought about marriage and intimacy could be very different from what polite society expected them to admit, which is exactly where we're going next. Now, if there's one subject Victorian society could make extraordinarily complicated, it was sex. Everyone knew it existed. Everyone was having it. People were producing children at a fairly impressive rate. And yet, somehow, discussing it openly was considered an excellent way to make an entire room suddenly become fascinated by the wallpaper. For wealthy married women, this could create a particularly strange situation. They were expected to become wives, they were expected to become mothers, they were expected to fulfill their marital duties, but they weren't necessarily encouraged to understand, discuss, or openly express what they actually wanted. And that distinction matters. Because the popular image of the Victorian woman as completely uninterested in sex is misleading. Women had desires, they had preferences, they had fears, they had experiences, and they certainly had opinions about their husbands. The problem was finding somewhere safe to put those opinions. A close friend might hear them, a sister might hear them, a private diary might hear them, a doctor might hear them. But saying them directly across the breakfast table? Probably not. Imagine the scene. Your husband is reading the newspaper. You're sitting across from him. The tea is being poured. The children are somewhere upstairs. And you suddenly decide this is the perfect moment to discuss your intimate dissatisfaction. You could probably hear the entire household stop breathing. So women developed another skill, speaking indirectly. They could talk about nerves, they could talk about weakness, they could talk about fatigue, they could talk about women's troubles. And suddenly, an extremely personal problem had been transformed into something medically respectable. This was particularly important because Victorian medicine had developed an enormous interest in women's bodies. Unfortunately, the doctors didn't always understand them. Women were frequently described through theories about delicate constitutions, nerves, reproductive organs, and supposed female weaknesses. A woman who was exhausted might be told she needed rest. A woman who was anxious might be told her nerves were delicate. A woman who was depressed might receive a diagnosis that made her sound less like a person experiencing emotional distress and more like a malfunctioning Victorian appliance. And wealthy women had access to doctors. Sometimes very expensive doctors. But access to medical care didn't necessarily mean good understanding. And sometimes medical treatment could become its own kind of secret. A wife might consult a doctor about something she didn't want her husband to know. She might discuss menstrual problems, pain, pregnancy, childbirth, sexual health, or symptoms that she was embarrassed to describe to anyone else. And because conversations between women and their doctors could involve extremely personal matters, the doctor's office could become one of the few places where a woman could speak openly about her body, at least in theory. But there was another enormous issue: pregnancy. For wealthy Victorian women, pregnancy could dominate married life. A woman could spend years of her marriage becoming pregnant, giving birth, recovering, and becoming pregnant again. And this wasn't simply uncomfortable. It could be dangerous. Every pregnancy carried risks. Childbirth could involve severe bleeding, infection, obstructed labor, stillbirth, and complications that modern medicine can often treat much more effectively. Victorian women didn't have that luxury. So a woman who became pregnant wasn't simply preparing for a new baby. She was preparing for an experience that could genuinely threaten her life. And yet, in polite society, pregnancy itself could be treated as something that wasn't supposed to be discussed too directly. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew why it had happened. But nobody wanted to say exactly what had happened. This created one of the strangest linguistic games in history. A woman wasn't pregnant. She was confined, or expecting, or in the family way, or simply unwell. Apparently, the entire Victorian population agreed that the baby had arrived through some mysterious process that nobody needed to investigate. And women themselves understood exactly what the language meant. There was another reason pregnancy could become something a woman kept private. She might not want another child. Now, this is where we have to be careful not to project modern assumptions backward. Victorian women had different beliefs, different circumstances, and different relationships with motherhood. Some desperately wanted large families. Some loved being mothers. Some felt enormous pressure to have children. And some were exhausted by repeated pregnancies. A wealthy household might celebrate the arrival of another baby. Meanwhile, the woman who had actually carried that baby for 9 months might be thinking, "Fantastic, I have to do this again." And she may not have had many socially acceptable ways to express that frustration. So women talked among themselves. They shared advice. They exchanged information. They discussed pregnancies, childbirth, nursing, doctors, remedies, and bodily problems. And this private female network was incredibly important because women could sometimes learn things from one another that formal institutions didn't teach them. Your mother might tell you. Your sister might tell you. A close friend might tell you. Your maid might tell you. And sometimes the information circulating between women was more practical than anything a respectable medical book had to offer. This is one of the recurring themes we're going to see. The official version of Victorian womanhood was one thing. The private female world was another. Publicly, how delightful. Privately, are you experiencing the same horrible thing I am? Publicly, what a beautiful baby. Privately, please tell me how you survived childbirth. Publicly, how fortunate you are to have such a wonderful husband. Privately, does yours do this too? That private conversation mattered because wealthy women could be physically surrounded by people and still experience enormous isolation. Think about the structure of a huge Victorian house. You could have servants everywhere, people coming and going, children running around, visitors arriving, letters being delivered, meals being prepared. And yet you might still spend hours completely alone, especially if your husband was working, traveling, visiting a club, attending political meetings, managing an estate, or simply doing whatever wealthy Victorian men did when they weren't being photographed, looking miserable. So the woman needed her own social world. And one of the most important parts of that world was friendship. Female friendships could be extraordinarily intimate. Women wrote to each other constantly. They visited one another. They exchanged gifts. They discussed their children, their health, their husbands, their families, their worries, their social obligations, and sometimes things they could never comfortably discuss with men. A letter between close female friends could become a private space where the rules of polite society loosened. You could complain. You could confess. You could ask questions. You could admit you were miserable. And you could say things that would have been completely inappropriate at the dinner table. But letters had another advantage. They could travel. A woman didn't have to wait until her friend came to visit. She could sit down at her writing desk and tell her everything. And wealthy Victorian women often had writing desks, which is convenient. Because if you're going to maintain a secret emotional life, a desk is an excellent place to start. The husband might walk past the room. He might see his wife writing. He might even ask, "Who are you writing to?" And the answer could be completely innocent. Mother, your sister, lady, something or other. And perhaps it was. But the letter could contain an entirely different world. Because the real secret wasn't necessarily that she was doing something forbidden. It was that she had a part of herself her husband simply didn't have access to. And that might have been incredibly valuable. A private identity. Private friendships. Private thoughts. Private money. Private correspondence. Private medical concerns. For a woman living inside a highly controlled social system, those little areas of privacy could become surprisingly important. But there was another place where Victorian women could quietly exercise control: their appearance. Now, you'd think fashion was simply about looking beautiful. And yes, it was. But clothing could also communicate status, wealth, marital position, respectability, age, and even social ambitions. A wealthy woman's wardrobe could be enormous. And behind those beautiful dresses was an entire industry. Dressmakers, milliners, corset makers, shoemakers, laundresses, jewelry dealers, and, of course, the lady's maid. The lady's maid was particularly important because she was the person who actually knew what the mistress looked like before she was transformed into the polished woman everyone else saw. She knew about the clothes, the body, the hair, the cosmetics, the injuries, the illnesses, the stains, the embarrassing wardrobe problems, and potentially the secrets. A husband might see his wife enter the dining room looking perfectly elegant. Her lady's maid knew what happened 30 minutes earlier, which means the lady's maid was essentially running a classified intelligence department with a hairbrush. And if a wealthy woman wanted something hidden, she needed someone she trusted, because privacy in a huge household was surprisingly difficult. There were always people around, and people notice things. They notice when a woman is suddenly receiving more letters. They notice when she begins visiting a particular friend. They notice when a new doctor starts visiting the house. They notice when she looks ill. They notice when her husband is away. They notice when somebody stays too long. And they definitely notice when someone starts behaving strangely. Which brings us to the subject Victorian society was absolutely obsessed with: reputation. Because a rich woman's reputation wasn't just her own. It belonged, in a strange way, to her entire family. And that meant a secret could be dangerous, even if the secret itself wasn't particularly terrible. A rumor could be enough. A whisper could be enough. Someone seeing you talking to the wrong person could be enough. And once gossip started, good luck stopping it. Because Victorian society had no social media. It had something worse: people with free afternoons. And they had absolutely nothing better to do than discuss what happened at somebody's dinner party last Tuesday. So wealthy women became extremely good at managing appearances, and some became very good at managing information. Because if everyone knows everything about you, you have no privacy. But if everyone believes they know everything about you, you can sometimes hide quite a lot. And that brings us to something wealthy Victorian women understood extremely well: the difference between being watched and actually being known. Because a woman could be seen by hundreds of people and still have almost nobody who knew what she was really thinking. And sometimes that was exactly how she wanted it. Now, if there was one thing that could make a perfectly respectable Victorian household suddenly become extremely complicated, it was money. Because being rich and controlling wealth were not necessarily the same thing. And for wealthy married women, this distinction could be enormous. Imagine being surrounded by expensive furniture, servants, jewelry, carriages, beautiful dresses, enormous meals, and enough silverware to equip a small army, while still having to think carefully about where your personal money was coming from. Because marriage could change a woman's legal and financial position in major ways. And the rules changed over the course of the Victorian period, which is important. The Victorian era lasted from 1837 to 1901. That's more than 60 years. So the legal situation of a married woman in 1840 was not necessarily the same as the situation in 1890. Things were changing, slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but they were changing. And one of the biggest developments concerned married women's property. Under the older system of English law, marriage could severely restrict a married woman's independent control over property and income. In simple terms, once a woman married, the law could treat her economic identity very differently from when she was unmarried, which creates a rather awkward situation. Because imagine inheriting money from your parents, and then discovering that marriage has dramatically changed who gets to control it. Not exactly the wedding present you were hoping for. This is why property became such an important issue for wealthy families. Parents with money had options. They could make arrangements. They could create trusts. They could structure inheritances. They could try to protect assets for their daughters. And wealthy families became very interested in the legal details of marriage settlements. Because if you were marrying into another powerful family, nobody wanted to simply hand over a fortune and say, "Here you go. Hope everything works out." No. There were lawyers, there were documents, there were conditions, there were trustees. There were carefully arranged financial agreements. Basically, the wedding could come with its own financial engineering department. And this is where wealthy women could sometimes have more financial protection than women without money. Not necessarily because society suddenly became progressive, but because wealth creates options. If your family had money, they could hire lawyers. They could establish trusts. They could arrange settlements. They could protect certain assets. They could negotiate. And they could sometimes make sure a daughter wasn't completely financially dependent on her husband. But this also meant something else. A wealthy woman could know quite a lot about money. Much more than the stereotype of the helpless Victorian wife suggests. She might know what her household cost. She might know what her allowance was. She might know what her investments were doing. She might know what her children were going to inherit. She might know which relatives were financially irresponsible. And she might have very strong opinions about all of it, especially if her husband was terrible with money. Because wealthy men were not automatically good at managing wealth. Some gambled. Some speculated. Some invested badly. Some spent enormous amounts maintaining estates. Some bought horses. Some bought houses. Some bought things simply because they could. And if you're a wife watching your husband's money disappear into increasingly questionable decisions, you might have a few thoughts. You just might not announce them during dinner. Instead, you could speak to your lawyer, your father, your brother, your trustee, your banker, your mother, your sister, your closest friend. And suddenly, the supposedly passive Victorian wife is sitting in a room discussing property law, which is not exactly the image we usually get. Because the private financial world of wealthy women could be surprisingly sophisticated. They could inherit, they could invest, they could donate, they could fund charities, they could support relatives, they could buy expensive personal items. And later in the Victorian period, legal reforms increasingly strengthened married women's ability to own and control property in their own right. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 were particularly important developments. The 1870 Act gave married women greater rights over certain earnings and property, while the 1882 Act went much further in recognizing married women's separate property. So by the end of the Victorian period, the legal landscape was significantly different from what it had been at the beginning. But here's the funny thing. Laws can change faster than social expectations. A woman might gain a new legal right while her family continued behaving as though nothing had changed. Because you can pass an act of parliament. You cannot pass an act of parliament saying, your husband must stop asking why you bought another dress. That requires negotiation. And Victorian women became very familiar with negotiation. Because there were certain things you didn't necessarily demand. You persuaded. You suggested. You hinted. You arranged. You asked someone else to ask. You created a situation where the decision appeared to be somebody else's idea. And this could be particularly useful in a household where the husband considered himself the ultimate authority. If a wife wanted something, she didn't always need to confront him directly. She could work around him. And sometimes the household itself gave her opportunities. Remember all those servants? They needed paying. Supplies needed ordering. Children needed clothing. Guests needed entertaining. Charities needed donations. Relatives needed gifts. There were endless legitimate expenses, which meant that a woman managing a large household could have considerable practical control over money even if she didn't technically own all of it. She knew where it went. She knew what it bought. She knew who received it. And she knew what could be justified as necessary. This brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of wealthy Victorian women's private lives: charity. Charity was socially respectable, very respectable. A wealthy woman could donate money to hospitals, schools, orphanages, religious organizations, poor families, medical causes, women's institutions. And charitable work gave women a socially acceptable way to exercise influence outside the immediate household. It was also one of the areas where women could build networks. They organized events, collected donations, visited institutions, corresponded with other wealthy women, raised money, and sometimes became deeply involved in causes their husbands didn't necessarily care much about. So charity wasn't simply, here's some money, have a nice day. It could become a form of social power. A woman could become known for supporting a particular cause. People could come to her for help. She could develop connections. She could influence which institutions received money. And she could create an identity that existed separately from being someone's wife. Which is important, because one of the biggest things wealthy Victorian women could privately want was not necessarily rebellion. It was an identity of their own. Not simply Mrs. somebody, but herself, her interests, her friends, her causes, her money, her correspondence, her opinions, her achievements. And this becomes especially interesting when you look at women who were wealthy enough to pursue intellectual or artistic interests. Some collected books, some wrote, some painted, some studied science, some became patrons of artists, some supported educational institutions. Some became involved in politics and reform movements, and although their opportunities were still heavily restricted compared with men, wealth could provide resources. A woman with money could buy books, hire a tutor, travel, support a project, host intellectual gatherings, donate to a cause, and sometimes quietly fund things her husband didn't particularly care about. Money could become a form of independence, not unlimited independence, but enough to create space. And that space mattered, because if you control even a small part of your own resources, you have options. And options are incredibly useful when your entire social system expects you to behave. But there was another kind of financial secret. Something much less respectable: debt. Because wealthy people could get into debt too. In fact, wealth could make it easier to spend enormous amounts of money before realizing how enormous the bill had become. Luxury is expensive. Large houses are expensive. Servants are expensive. Horses are expensive. Clothing is expensive. Travel is expensive. Entertaining guests is expensive. Maintaining a social position is expensive. And if the husband had a taste for gambling, racing, expensive hobbies, or speculative investments, well, the household finances could become a disaster wearing a very expensive coat. And women knew this. Some wives had to deal with husbands whose spending threatened the family's financial future. Some had to protect children from financial instability. Some had to negotiate with creditors. Some relied on family support. And some probably sat at home thinking, we have 3 houses, 14 servants, 6 horses, and somehow no money, which is a very Victorian form of financial planning. But there was something even more personal than household spending. A woman might have money she considered hers, money given to her by her parents. Money inherited from relatives, money saved from allowances, money connected to property, money intended for her children. And the question became, how much of that did her husband know about? And how much did he actually control? The answer depended heavily on the legal and family circumstances. But the fact that women could have their own financial interests meant that the private financial relationship between husband and wife could be much more complicated than the public image suggested. The husband might be the person everyone assumed was in charge. The wife might know exactly where the family's real wealth was. And sometimes she might be the person quietly making sure it survived. Because rich Victorian women weren't simply spending money. Some were protecting it, managing it, negotiating over it, and occasionally hiding it. And if you think money was complicated, wait until we get to the one thing that could turn a wealthy Victorian household upside down almost instantly: a woman's health. Because illness wasn't just uncomfortable. It could affect her marriage, her pregnancy, her reputation, her ability to run the household. And sometimes, what she told the doctor was something she absolutely did not want her husband hearing about. Hey, sleepy little aristocrat, still awake? Good. Because now we're getting into one of the most private parts of Victorian life, the doctor's room. And this was one place where a wealthy woman could sometimes say things she absolutely did not want to discuss at the dinner table. Because Victorian medicine had a rather fascinating relationship with women. Doctors were increasingly professional. Medical knowledge was expanding. Hospitals were developing. New treatments were appearing. And yet, doctors still had an enormous amount to learn about the human body, especially the female body. And if you were a wealthy Victorian woman, you had something most people didn't have: access to doctors. You could afford consultations. You could have a physician visit your home. You could be examined privately. You could have medicines prepared specifically for you. And perhaps most importantly, you could describe symptoms that were considered far too embarrassing to discuss with your husband. Because imagine trying to explain a deeply personal medical problem while your husband is sitting 3 feet away. No. That conversation was going to happen somewhere else. Perhaps in the doctor's office. Perhaps behind a closed bedroom door. Perhaps in a letter. And this is one reason women's private medical correspondence is so revealing. Because suddenly the polite Victorian lady disappears, and you're reading about pain, bleeding, pregnancy, childbirth, menstrual problems, exhaustion, headaches, anxiety, insomnia, and all the other unpleasant things that happen when your body decides it has had enough of Victorian life. But there was a problem. Doctors didn't always understand what they were looking at. Victorian medicine was improving rapidly, but many diseases still had mysterious causes. Doctors didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have modern imaging. They didn't have modern laboratory testing. And they certainly couldn't simply order a scan and say, yes, there's the problem. Instead, they had to rely heavily on observation. What did the patient feel? How long had it lasted? What did the pulse feel like? What did the skin look like? What was the patient's appetite? How was their sleep? What was happening with digestion? And for women, what was happening with menstruation and pregnancy? This could produce extremely detailed medical questioning, and some of it was genuinely useful. But some Victorian medical theories about women were also deeply shaped by contemporary ideas about femininity. Women were often portrayed as physically delicate, emotionally sensitive, nervous, reproductive, and somehow simultaneously too fragile for certain activities and perfectly capable of producing 6 children. A fascinating system. Apparently, the female body was both incredibly delicate and expected to survive repeated pregnancies without complaint. And if a woman became exhausted, well, perhaps her nerves were weak. If she experienced anxiety, perhaps her nerves again. If she couldn't sleep? The nerves were apparently having another meeting. The word nervous could become a remarkably convenient explanation for almost anything doctors didn't fully understand. And wealthy women were particularly associated with this idea because they lived lives that medical writers sometimes interpreted through the lens of class and leisure. A woman who was bored, anxious, exhausted, depressed, or dissatisfied could be treated as though the problem was somehow connected to her lifestyle. She had too much leisure, too much sensitivity, too much imagination, too much nervous energy. Basically, if you were rich and unhappy, someone might decide you simply needed to stop thinking so much. Excellent medical advice. But women didn't always accept these explanations. They continued describing their symptoms. They continued searching for doctors. And they continued experimenting with treatments. Which brings us to another part of Victorian medicine that women could become extremely familiar with: patent medicines. These were commercially produced remedies sold for all kinds of problems. Some were based on herbs, some contained alcohol, some contained genuinely active ingredients, and some contained substances that we'd look at today and immediately say, perhaps don't drink that. Yet people bought them. Because if you're suffering from something that nobody has properly explained, and a bottle promises to fix it, you're probably going to at least consider buying it, especially if the advertisement tells you that thousands of other people have already been cured. And Victorian advertising was very good at making things sound miraculous. Tired? This medicine will restore you. Weak? This medicine will strengthen you. Nervous? This medicine will calm you. Digestive problems? Apparently this medicine can fix those too. And if you're a wealthy woman with money to spend in a private medical concern you don't want to discuss with anyone, a bottle arriving at the house could be a lot easier than explaining yourself to another person. But there was another problem: pregnancy. Because once a woman became pregnant, her body became the subject of intense medical and social attention. And wealthy women could have private doctors monitoring them. They could receive advice about diet, rest, exercise, travel, childbirth, and postpartum recovery. But pregnancy could still be frightening, especially because childbirth was dangerous. A woman could begin labor expecting everything to go normally, and then suddenly something went wrong. The baby could be positioned badly. Labor could become obstructed. Severe bleeding could occur. Infection could follow. And there were limited ways to intervene safely. This meant wealthy Victorian women had something that modern people sometimes forget. They could be terrified of pregnancy. Not because they didn't want children, but because they understood that childbirth could kill them. And they didn't have the modern safety net we take for granted. There were no modern blood banks, no antibiotics, no modern obstetric surgery, no intensive care unit waiting down the hallway. A doctor could be extremely experienced and still be working with a terrifyingly limited set of tools. So a woman's private medical conversations could involve some very serious fears. Would the baby survive? Would she survive? Could she have another pregnancy? Would she recover? Would she become permanently ill? And these weren't theoretical questions. They were real possibilities. But perhaps one of the most interesting things about Victorian women's health is how often women themselves exchanged medical information. Women talked. They compared experiences. They recommended doctors. They discussed medicines. They described childbirth. They talked about menstruation. They warned each other about treatments. And sometimes they knew what worked for them, even when the medical establishment had no clear explanation. This informal network of women could be enormously important. Your mother, your sister, your cousin, your close friend, your maid, your nurse. The women around you could know things about your body that your husband never did. And they could tell you things that a formal medical consultation might never mention. This also applied to something that was often treated as mysterious: menstruation. For Victorian women, menstruation was a normal part of life, but it was surrounded by enormous amounts of embarrassment, euphemism, and medical speculation. Women had to manage it while wearing elaborate clothing, while attending dinners, while traveling, while managing households, while raising children, while being expected to look elegant. And nobody wanted to discuss it openly. Imagine wearing several layers of clothing, traveling by carriage over roads that could generously be described as terrible, and trying to deal with a painful period. Then someone asks, "Are you enjoying the afternoon?" No. She is not. She is fighting a private biological war beneath 12 layers of fabric, but she is smiling. Because etiquette. And wealthy women had another advantage here. They had servants, especially ladies' maids. A lady's maid could help with clothing, personal care, and all the practical problems that came with maintaining a fashionable appearance, which meant the maid could become one of the most trusted people in the household. She might know when her mistress was ill. She might know when she was pregnant. She might know when she was menstruating. She might know which medicines she took. She might know which doctor visited. She might know when the mistress had been crying. And she might know what the husband didn't. That is a remarkable amount of information for one person to possess. And this is why servants appear again and again when we look at private Victorian life. They were not invisible. The social ideal might have been for servants to fade into the background, but they were physically present. They carried messages. They delivered letters. They prepared meals. They helped women dress. They entered bedrooms. They answered doors. They accompanied people on journeys. They saw who came to the house. And they noticed things. Lots of things. A wealthy woman could therefore have an entire private world that existed in the spaces between these people. And sometimes the most trusted person in that world wasn't her husband. It was her maid. Now, there's something else women could keep from their husbands that was even more personal. How unhappy they actually were. Because illness and unhappiness could become connected. A woman who was chronically exhausted might not simply be physically tired. She might be overwhelmed. A woman who couldn't sleep might be anxious. A woman who constantly complained of headaches might be under enormous emotional pressure. And a woman who was expected to maintain a perfect household could have very little opportunity to simply stop. There were children, servants, guests, family, social obligations, and the constant pressure to appear respectable. So sometimes the body became the place where all of that pressure appeared. And the doctor became the person who heard about it. Not the husband, not the guests, not the neighbors, the doctor. And this creates a fascinating contradiction. Victorian society could be extremely restrictive about what women were allowed to say publicly, but the medical world created a private vocabulary through which some of those things could be discussed. A woman didn't necessarily have to say, "I'm miserable." She could say, "I haven't slept." She didn't necessarily have to say, "I'm overwhelmed." She could say, "I feel weak." She didn't necessarily have to say, "I am frightened of another pregnancy." She could describe her physical symptoms, and suddenly a deeply personal problem had become a medical consultation. It wasn't always enough. It wasn't always understood correctly, but at least the conversation could happen. And sometimes that was the first step. Because behind the perfect dress, the enormous house, the polished dinner table, and the smiling portrait was a human being with a body that could hurt, and a mind that could become exhausted. And if her husband didn't know about any of it, well, perhaps that was exactly the point. Because the next people who knew almost everything were the people working inside her house. The servants. And if you think a wealthy Victorian household was a private place, wait until you find out just how much the servants actually knew. Now, if you were a wealthy Victorian woman and you really wanted to keep something secret, there was one small problem. You had servants. Lots of them. And servants had a terrible habit of being everywhere. The lady's maid was there when you woke up. The housemaid was there when you went to bed. The cook knew what everyone was eating. The nursemaid knew what the children were saying. The footman answered the door. The butler knew who arrived. And somewhere in the middle of all this stood the wealthy husband, confidently believing he was the master of his household. Meanwhile, 20 people knew what he'd been doing since breakfast. The Victorian household was basically an information network wearing uniforms. And the woman of the house was sitting right in the middle of it. This mattered enormously because servants weren't simply people who cleaned rooms. They entered private spaces. They carried messages. They handled clothing. They prepared food. They delivered letters. They accompanied their employers outside the house. They knew which guests visited. They knew which rooms were occupied. And they knew when someone was behaving strangely. A lady's maid, in particular, could become extraordinarily close to her mistress. She might help her dress every morning. She might arrange her hair. She might prepare her clothes. She might help her pack for travel. She might assist during illness. She might hear private conversations. And because she was physically present during so many intimate moments, she could know things that even close relatives didn't. Imagine being the husband. You think you know your wife. You see her at breakfast. You see her at dinner. You accompany her to parties. You know what she tells you. But her lady's maid? She knows what happened before breakfast. She knows whether your wife slept, whether she cried, whether she was ill, whether she received a letter, whether she's furious with someone, whether she's worried about money, whether she's secretly preparing for a trip, and potentially, whether she's trying very hard to hide something. This doesn't mean servants were automatically involved in every secret. Far from it. Many relationships between employers and servants were formal, distant, and strictly hierarchical. But the structure of the household made privacy complicated. A wealthy woman might close the door. But somebody still had to knock. She might write a letter. Somebody had to deliver it. She might receive a visitor. Somebody had to open the door. She might want to go somewhere. Somebody might have to prepare the carriage. And every one of those little interactions created opportunities for information to leak. This is why wealthy women had to learn something very important: who could be trusted. Because not every servant was equally loyal. And not every servant had the same relationship with the family. Some had worked for the household for years. Others stayed only briefly. Some were deeply attached to their employers. Others were simply doing a job. And servants themselves had their own social networks. A housemaid might speak to another housemaid. A cook might know someone working for a neighboring family. A footman might hear something from another servant while out shopping. And suddenly, information that was supposed to remain inside one house could travel to another. The aristocratic neighborhood had its own unofficial news service. No newspaper required. Someone's daughter was pregnant. Someone's husband was gambling. Someone's son had been sent away. Someone's marriage was unhappy. Someone had spent too much money. Someone had a new doctor. Someone's servants were leaving. Someone's family was in financial trouble. And somehow everybody knew. This is one reason reputation could be so fragile. Because a wealthy household wasn't sealed off from society. It was constantly exchanging people. Visitors came. Servants left. Letters arrived. Guests stayed overnight. Family members visited. Children went to school. Horses went to stables. Food came in. Laundry went out. And with every movement came information. So a woman who wanted to keep something private had to think beyond her husband. She had to think about the household. Who knew? Who might notice? Who might talk? Who might accidentally reveal something? And perhaps most importantly, who could be bribed with a sufficiently large tip? Money could certainly help. A generous mistress might earn loyalty. A thoughtful employer could become deeply respected by her servants. And a servant who felt valued might be much more willing to protect her mistress's privacy. But there was another side to this relationship. Servants could also have enormous power over the reputation of the people they worked for. Not formal power. Social power. They knew what happened behind closed doors. And sometimes that knowledge was worth something. This doesn't mean every servant was blackmailing their employer. Most weren't. But the possibility existed. And wealthy people understood that. Which is why household management wasn't simply about cleaning. It was also about trust. A woman might choose her lady's maid carefully. She might keep certain servants close. She might dismiss others. She might reward loyalty. She might avoid allowing particular people access to certain rooms. And she might know exactly which servant could be trusted with which piece of information. Think about how much information a lady's maid could accumulate over 5 years. She knows the wardrobe, the jewelry, the correspondence, the illnesses, the pregnancies, the arguments, the visitors, the travel plans, the family relationships, the mistress's moods, and potentially her romantic life. Because if a mysterious letter arrives addressed to the mistress, somebody has to bring it upstairs. If the mistress suddenly wants to go out alone, somebody has to arrange the carriage. If a visitor arrives unexpectedly, somebody has to let them in. And if the visitor is a man who isn't supposed to be visiting, well, someone noticed. This is where the stereotype of Victorian secrecy gets interesting. People often imagine secret affairs as elaborate cinematic operations. A woman sneaks out through a window. A man waits beneath the balcony. Someone dramatically whispers, "Meet me at midnight." Sometimes real life was much less exciting. Often, secrecy depended on ordinary people cooperating. A servant who didn't ask questions. A maid who delivered a message. A footman who didn't mention who had arrived. A friend who understood when to leave. A household member who simply pretended not to notice. And that could create an invisible network of discretion. But discretion had limits, because servants also had their own lives. They needed wages. They could leave. They could be dismissed. They could become angry. And they could move to another household, which meant that a secret wasn't necessarily safe forever. A servant might leave the house and take years of memories with them. And if they went to work for another wealthy family, suddenly your private information had traveled across town. Imagine the social disaster. Good afternoon. Lovely weather. Yes, indeed. How is Lady whatever? Oh, she's very well. Excellent. I remember when I used to work for her. Oh, yes. And suddenly everyone becomes extremely interested in their tea because the servant knows things. Now, women weren't only dealing with servants, they also had governesses, companions, nurses, and ladies' companions. These women could occupy an unusual position. They weren't quite family. They weren't exactly servants in the same way as a housemaid. They were educated. They might spend long periods with the mistress or children, and they could become confidantes. A companion, especially, could be with a wealthy, unmarried, or widowed woman for much of the day. Someone to walk with, read with, travel with, talk with, and sometimes complain with. Because one of the easiest ways to survive a restrictive social environment is to find another person who understands exactly how ridiculous it is. You don't even need to rebel. You can simply exchange a look, a tiny raised eyebrow across the dining room, a glance when someone says something absurd, a private laugh afterward, and suddenly you've created a secret language. Women became very good at this. The public conversation could remain perfectly polite. Meanwhile, the real conversation was happening through facial expressions, and the richer the household, the more elaborate the performance could become. A dinner party might contain 12 people politely discussing the weather. Meanwhile, one woman knows her husband is furious. Another knows her daughter is secretly engaged. A third knows someone has financial problems. The butler knows which guest arrived late. The maid knows who cried upstairs. And somebody's mother knows everything. Nobody says anything, because respectable society has rules. And breaking those rules could have consequences. This brings us back to the central problem of Victorian womanhood: visibility. A wealthy woman was constantly being observed. Her clothes were observed. Her manners were observed. Her marriage was observed. Her marriage was observed. Her spending were observed. Her spending was observed. And because of that, she had to become extremely good at controlling what other people saw. The goal wasn't necessarily to hide everything. That would be impossible. The goal was to make sure that the version people saw was the version you wanted them to believe. And that could be surprisingly powerful. You could be angry without looking angry. You could be unhappy without looking unhappy. You could dislike someone while remaining perfectly polite. You could have private ambitions while appearing completely conventional. You could even disagree with your husband while publicly appearing to support him. And sometimes that was the only practical way to exercise influence. Because direct confrontation could be socially expensive. Quiet persuasion wasn't. A woman might say, "Perhaps you should reconsider." Instead of, "You're being an idiot." She might say, "Wouldn't it be rather unfortunate if," instead of, "I'm absolutely going to stop you." And if the husband changed his mind afterward, well, perhaps it had been his idea all along. Victorian women didn't necessarily need to win arguments. Sometimes they just needed to make sure the final decision went in the direction they wanted. And servants could help with that too. A well-organized household gave a woman enormous practical influence. She could decide which guests were invited, which social calls were returned, which charities received attention, which relatives were welcomed, which children received special opportunities, and sometimes which information reached her husband. Because information doesn't have to be completely false to be controlled. You can simply decide when someone hears it, or how they hear it, or who tells them. And that brings us to another private world that Victorian women controlled remarkably well: their friendships. Because once the servants went to bed, and the husband was somewhere else, and the formal social performance was finally over, women could talk to one another. And what they said in those private conversations could be very different from what they said in public. They discussed husbands, children, money, illness, pregnancy, love, sex, family, scandal, and sometimes the single most dangerous sentence in Victorian society: "You know what I really think? Hey, still awake? Good." Because sometimes the person a Victorian woman trusted most wasn't her husband. It was another woman, a sister, a cousin, a childhood friend, a neighbor, a former schoolmate, or simply someone who understood what it was like to spend an entire afternoon pretending everything was perfectly fine. Because friendship gave wealthy Victorian women something marriage didn't always provide: a place to complain without having to be polite. And they had plenty to complain about. Your husband is annoying? Tell your friend. Your mother-in-law is unbearable? Tell your friend. Your dressmaker has ruined the sleeves again? Tell your friend. Your husband has invited 12 people to dinner without warning you? Definitely tell your friend. Because apparently the 19th century had discovered the ancient female tradition of saying, "I cannot believe this man," and then spending the next 2 hours explaining exactly why. But these friendships could be much deeper than gossip. Women relied on one another for practical information. Pregnancy, childbirth, doctors, nurses, servants, schools, marriage, money, bereavement, illness, and all the little problems that came with running a wealthy household. If you were young and newly married, an older female relative might teach you things nobody had properly explained before. How to manage servants, how to receive guests, how to organize a dinner, how to deal with your husband's family, how to write the right kind of letter, how to behave when somebody insulted you without actually saying anything insulting. Because Victorian society had turned indirect communication into an Olympic sport. You didn't say, "I don't like you." You said, "How interesting that you decided to come." And everybody understood. Women could also use friendship to create private emotional spaces. A woman might be perfectly cheerful in public and then write to her closest friend about how miserable she really felt. She could admit that she was lonely, that she missed her family, that she disliked social life, that she was worried about her children, that she was frightened about another pregnancy, that she was disappointed in her husband, or simply that she was exhausted from spending 6 hours being pleasant to people she didn't particularly enjoy. And letters were perfect for this. Because a letter gave you time. You didn't have to think of the perfect response immediately. You could sit at your desk, write something, cross it out, write it again, and eventually send your carefully edited emotional disaster through the post. It was the Victorian equivalent of typing an extremely long message and then deciding whether you're brave enough to press send. Except once you sent it, there was no deleting it. That made letters dangerous. They could be lost. Read by someone else, discovered years later, passed between family members, and preserved, sometimes forever, which is why private correspondence can reveal such a different side of historical people. The public version of a woman might be elegant, restrained, and almost painfully respectable. The private letter might contain sarcasm, frustration, jokes, anger, affection, and opinions that would have been completely inappropriate in public. And sometimes the language itself tells you something. Women didn't always say exactly what they meant. They used euphemisms, hints, private references, inside jokes. A sentence that looks completely innocent to a stranger could mean something very different to the person receiving it. And this allowed women to communicate privately while maintaining plausible deniability. Very useful. Because Victorian respectability was partly about what could be proven. If everyone knew what you meant, but nobody could actually point to a scandalous sentence, well, perhaps everything was fine. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of female friendship: the ability to share information. Women could recommend doctors. They could warn each other about particular treatments. They could discuss difficult pregnancies. They could recommend servants. They could talk about schools. They could share information about husbands. And sometimes they could warn each other about men. Because women were not living in isolation. They were observing the same social world. They attended the same dinners, the same dances, the same country house visits, the same church services, the same social events. And they noticed things. A man who flirted too much, a man who drank too much, a man who spent too much, a man whose financial situation wasn't quite what everyone thought, a man whose marriage wasn't nearly as happy as it appeared. And women talked, sometimes discreetly, sometimes enthusiastically, and sometimes with the kind of detail that makes modern gossip look like amateur work. Because imagine having no group chat, no social media, no online forum, no text messages. What do? You invite your friend over for tea. Problem solved. And the tea table could become a private information exchange. One woman knows something about a family in London. Another knows something about a marriage. Someone else has heard about an upcoming engagement. Someone's cousin has a servant who used to work for another family, and suddenly the entire room knows what happened 3 counties away. The information traveled through social networks that were almost impossible to map completely, and wealthy women were often at the center of those networks. This also meant that friendships could become politically important. A woman might know influential people through her family. Her husband might know politicians. But she had her own social relationships, and those relationships could sometimes influence what happened inside the household. A wife might persuade her husband to meet someone, recommend someone for a position, support a charitable cause, encourage a marriage, discourage a marriage, or quietly connect people who needed one another. She didn't necessarily need an official political position. She could simply know the right people. And that kind of influence is easy to underestimate, because history often records the person who signed the document, not the person who convinced them to sign it. But perhaps the most important thing about female friendship was emotional. A wealthy Victorian woman could have everything society considered desirable and still be lonely. Imagine spending your entire life being told how fortunate you are. You live in a beautiful house. You have servants. You have nice clothes. Your family is respectable. Your husband has money. Your children are healthy. So why are you unhappy? That question can be surprisingly cruel, because material comfort doesn't automatically eliminate loneliness. And women knew this. They could recognize it in each other. One woman didn't have to explain everything. Sometimes a friend simply understood, and that understanding could become incredibly important, especially for women whose husbands traveled frequently. Men of wealthy families could spend long periods away managing estates, conducting business, traveling, serving in political roles, visiting clubs, attending social events, or pursuing military or colonial careers. The wife might remain behind, running the household, raising the children, managing servants, waiting for letters, and sometimes waiting became a significant part of married life. A letter from your husband arrives. You read it. You answer it. Then you wait again. Meanwhile, your actual emotional life might be happening with your female friends. You see them. You write to them. You visit them. You talk. And eventually, they become the people who know what you're really thinking. Which creates an interesting question. If your husband is supposed to be your closest companion, but your best friend knows more about your fears, frustrations, and private thoughts, what exactly is the difference between marriage and friendship? Victorian women didn't necessarily answer that question the way we would, but they certainly experienced the tension, and sometimes those friendships became extremely intense. Women could exchange affectionate letters, use emotionally intimate language, give each other personal gifts, spend long periods together, and become deeply attached. That doesn't automatically mean there was a sexual relationship. It's important not to turn every intense historical friendship into a secret romance. People in different periods expressed friendship differently. But the emotional depth was real. And for some women, those relationships could be among the most meaningful connections in their lives. Because the husband might provide financial security. The marriage might provide social status. But the friend provided something else. Understanding. And then there were the friendships that crossed social boundaries. A wealthy woman might become close to a servant. A mistress might develop affection for her lady's maid. A woman might become attached to a governess. These relationships were complicated because class differences never disappeared. The employer still had power. The servant still depended on wages. But personal affection could exist alongside that hierarchy. And sometimes the person who knew a woman's private life best was someone society considered socially beneath her. That could create extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary vulnerability. Because if the relationship broke down, the secrets didn't disappear. They remained. And then there were the friendships that husbands simply didn't understand. A husband might consider his wife's friend frivolous, or annoying, or politically troublesome, or socially inappropriate. And the wife might disagree completely. She could continue seeing the friend anyway, perhaps not openly challenging her husband, perhaps simply arranging the visits, a little afternoon call, a letter, a walk, a social engagement. Nothing suspicious, nothing scandalous. Just enough contact to maintain a private world outside the marriage, and that private world mattered, because marriage did not erase a woman's identity. She had existed before her husband. She had friendships before him, memories before him, family before him, and she continued having thoughts that belonged entirely to herself. That might be one of the biggest secrets of wealthy Victorian womanhood. Not some enormous scandal, not an illicit affair, not a hidden fortune. Just the simple fact that she had an inner life her husband could never completely access. And perhaps that's why diaries and letters are so valuable. They give us tiny glimpses through the curtain. A woman complains. A woman jokes. A woman worries. A woman becomes furious. A woman falls in love. A woman misses someone. A woman describes her husband in a way she would never describe him publicly. And suddenly the portrait becomes human. Not Victorian wife. Not wealthy lady. Not Mrs. Somebody. Just a person. A person who sometimes wanted to scream. A person who sometimes wanted to disappear. A person who sometimes adored her family. A person who sometimes couldn't stand them. A person who could be generous and selfish, kind and petty, brave and frightened, exactly like everyone else. And once you start looking at these women as actual people rather than decorative figures standing beside Victorian furniture, another subject becomes impossible to ignore: love. Because friendship was one thing, marriage was another. But sometimes a woman could develop feelings for someone she absolutely wasn't supposed to, and that is where things become considerably more dangerous. Now, being married did not magically make other men disappear. Unfortunately for Victorian husbands, women still had eyes, and wealthy Victorian society gave them plenty of opportunities to use them. There were dinner parties, balls, country house weekends, the theater, church, horse races, garden parties, travel, and an endless parade of men who had been carefully dressed, introduced, and placed directly in front of respectable women. Obviously, everyone was expected to behave. A married woman wasn't supposed to flirt openly. She wasn't supposed to encourage scandal. She certainly wasn't supposed to make her husband look foolish in public. But attraction doesn't disappear simply because society has decided it would be inconvenient. And sometimes, a woman noticed someone. Maybe it was a family friend, maybe a neighbor, maybe her husband's colleague, maybe an old acquaintance, maybe someone she had known before she was married. And sometimes nothing happened. She simply noticed him. That was enough. Because a private attraction could exist entirely inside someone's head. Nobody else needed to know. She could attend dinner, smile politely, discuss the weather, and internally think something considerably less respectable. The Victorian social world was particularly good at creating situations where people could become familiar without appearing to seek each other out. You might see the same people repeatedly. At church, at parties, at dances, during visits, at country estates. Your families might know each other. Your husbands might be friends. And because everything happened within established social circles, a relationship could develop slowly. A conversation here, a letter there, a shared interest, a joke. A little too much eye contact. And suddenly, two people were looking forward to seeing each other. Now, does that automatically mean an affair? Absolutely not. This is where historical storytelling can become ridiculous if we're not careful. Not every Victorian woman who smiled at another man was secretly having an affair. Sometimes a smile was just a smile. Sometimes a friendship was just a friendship. Sometimes people genuinely liked one another without doing anything scandalous. But the possibility of romantic relationships outside marriage certainly existed. And when it did, the consequences could be enormous. Because wealthy women had reputations to protect. A man could sometimes survive behavior that would destroy a woman's social standing. That double standard mattered. A married woman caught in a scandal could face humiliation, separation, family conflict, and potentially devastating consequences for her children and future. So if a woman developed feelings for someone else, she had very good reasons to be careful. And careful women learn something very quickly. Letters are dangerous. Because a conversation disappears. A letter doesn't. A letter can be kept. Hidden, found, read, copied, and eventually shown to somebody else. So if you're going to write a secret letter, you'd better think very carefully about what you're putting on paper. Which is why Victorian correspondence could become wonderfully indirect. Instead of saying, "I can't stop thinking about you," you might write something that sounds completely innocent. A reference to a shared memory, a comment about a recent visit, a phrase only the recipient understands. Nothing obviously scandalous, but the two people know what it means. This kind of indirect communication could be incredibly useful. And also incredibly risky, because the more elaborate the secrecy became, the more people might notice. A letter arrives. A woman becomes nervous. A visitor suddenly appears. A servant is asked to deliver something privately. Someone begins taking longer walks. Someone suddenly has an excuse to attend the same social event. And eventually another person notices. And once somebody notices, gossip begins. Victorian gossip could destroy a reputation without anyone ever producing actual evidence. You didn't need proof. You needed suspicion, a few whispers, a raised eyebrow, a comment made during tea. Did you hear? And suddenly someone's perfectly respectable life had become entertainment for everyone else. This is why wealthy women sometimes had to be extraordinarily careful about appearances. You could not simply disappear with someone. You couldn't openly meet a lover whenever you wanted. There were servants, drivers, family members, neighbors, friends, and social schedules. Privacy was difficult, but there were opportunities. A country estate could provide more space. Travel could create distance from family. A large household could provide cover. Social events could provide plausible reasons for meeting people. And sometimes friendships could provide a respectable explanation for spending time together. But the emotional reality could be complicated. A woman might genuinely love her husband and still feel attracted to someone else. Human beings are annoyingly complicated like that. Marriage doesn't switch off every other emotion. And Victorian people were still human beings. They experienced jealousy, desire, infatuation, loneliness, regret, excitement, and heartbreak. They simply had a much more restrictive social environment in which to deal with those feelings, and sometimes the relationship never went anywhere. A woman might simply carry the secret for years. A private crush, a memory, a letter, a person she once knew. Something that existed entirely inside her private world. And in some cases, that might have been the most practical solution. Because acting on the feeling could destroy everything. But thinking about it? That was harder for society to police. And then there were women who did take the risk. Some relationships became physical. Some became emotional. Some were brief. Some lasted years. Some ended in disaster. And some remained secret. The details varied enormously from case to case, but the existence of extramarital relationships shouldn't surprise us. The Victorian period wasn't populated by people who suddenly stopped experiencing desire. It was populated by people who had developed elaborate rules about how desire was supposed to be hidden, and those rules applied differently depending on gender and class. A wealthy man's indiscretions might be tolerated as unfortunate behavior. A wealthy woman's could become a family catastrophe. This double standard meant that women had to think about consequences constantly. What happens to the children? What happens to the marriage? What happens to the family? What happens to the money? What happens to her social position? What happens if the other person's wife finds out? What happens if a servant sees them? What happens if someone finds a letter? What happens if someone starts talking? The secret wasn't simply, I like this person. The secret was, what happens if anyone finds out? And sometimes that fear was enough to stop everything. But there was another category of relationship that could be even more complicated. Emotional intimacy. A woman didn't necessarily need to have an affair to develop a deep attachment to another man. She could correspond with him, discuss books, talk about politics, share intellectual interests, ask his advice. And because Victorian society had very specific expectations about male-female relationships, even innocent intimacy could sometimes become complicated, especially if the husband became suspicious. And husbands weren't necessarily blind. They could notice things. They could become jealous. They could object to particular friendships. They could forbid certain visits. They could become angry about letters. And this could create another form of quiet resistance. A woman might obey publicly and continue the friendship privately. She might not confront her husband. She might simply find another way. And this brings us back to something we've seen repeatedly. Victorian women didn't always exercise influence through open rebellion. Sometimes they exercised it through privacy. The ability to have thoughts your husband didn't know. Friends he didn't completely understand. Money he didn't completely control. Letters he didn't read. And relationships he didn't know about. That doesn't make every Victorian woman secretly rebellious. Most people weren't. Most were simply trying to live their lives within the rules available to them. But within those rules, there was room. Room for negotiation. Room for friendship. Room for ambition. And sometimes room for love. And if a woman did fall in love with someone she wasn't supposed to, she now had a very serious problem. Because love creates evidence. Letters. Gifts. Memories. Visits. Expressions. And the most dangerous evidence of all, changes in behavior. You suddenly care what someone thinks. You dress differently. You become nervous when they enter the room. You remember details you shouldn't remember. You look for them at parties. And everyone who knows you well can see it, which is why some of the most dangerous secrets weren't written down at all. They were visible on someone's face. And Victorian society was very good at watching faces, because everyone was watching everyone. And there was one group of people who could notice a woman's appearance more closely than almost anyone else. Her servants. Especially her lady's maid. Which means we're about to return to the household. But this time, we're looking at something much more physical. The clothes. The beauty routines, the corsets, the hair, the cosmetics, and all the uncomfortable things a wealthy Victorian woman could be hiding underneath an absolutely perfect dress. Now, If you were a wealthy Victorian woman, looking respectable was practically a full-time occupation, and the outfit was only the beginning, because that enormous dress wasn't simply clothing. It was a message. It told everyone how wealthy you were, how respectable you were, whether you were married, where you were going, what kind of event you were attending, and, occasionally, how much suffering you were willing to tolerate for fashion. Because Victorian fashion was not exactly designed around the principle of, let's make this comfortable. No, comfort had apparently been defeated by fabric. There were layers, lots of layers, petticoats, corsets, skirts, blouses, bodices, stockings, gloves, bonnet, and whatever other pieces of fabric society had decided were necessary that particular morning. Getting dressed could take time, and for a wealthy woman, she often had help. Her lady's maid could prepare the clothing, fasten buttons, arrange the hair, adjust the dress, fix the corset, attach accessories, and make sure everything looked exactly right, because appearance mattered. A wealthy woman could not simply walk downstairs wearing yesterday's clothes and announce, "I've decided fashion is no longer my problem." People would notice. Her friends would notice. Her relatives would notice. Servants would notice. And, most importantly, the women she was competing socially with would notice. Victorian society could be surprisingly competitive. Not always openly. That would be rude. Instead, competition appeared through tiny details. Who had the newest dress? Who had the finest jewelry? Who had the most fashionable bonnet? Whose children were dressed best? Whose house was more impressive? Who gave the best dinner? Who had the most prestigious guests? And who somehow managed to look effortlessly elegant while everyone else was obviously trying? That last woman was dangerous, because looking effortless was itself a form of status. But maintaining that appearance could require an enormous amount of work. And money. Lots of money. A wealthy woman's clothing could be extremely expensive, and clothing wasn't disposable. A dress might be altered, reworked, trimmed, reused, passed down, sent to a dressmaker, adjusted for a different occasion. And the lady's maid had to know how to manage all of it. She also had to know the mistress's body, which meant the private reality of the woman could be very different from the public image. The public sees the finished dress. The maid sees the process. She sees the bruises, the discomfort, the sweat, the hairpins, the corset, the stains, the emergency repairs, the moments when the woman finally gets the dress off and takes a breath. And perhaps one of the most famous symbols of Victorian fashion is the corset. Now, the corset itself wasn't simply some evil device invented specifically to torture women. Its history is much more complicated. Women wore different forms of structured garments for centuries. Corsets could support the body, shape clothing, create a fashionable silhouette, and help dresses sit correctly. But fashion changed. And during parts of the Victorian period, tightly shaped waists became highly fashionable, which meant women could feel enormous pressure to achieve a particular silhouette. And the fashionable body was not necessarily the naturally occurring body. It had to be constructed, adjusted, compressed, enhanced, and then wrapped in enough fabric to make sure nobody could tell what was actually happening underneath, which creates a rather funny contradiction. Victorian society wanted women to look natural after spending an extraordinary amount of time making them look completely unnatural. And wealthy women had access to the best dressmakers, which meant they could participate heavily in these fashions. But that didn't make the process comfortable. A dress could be heavy. Shoes could be impractical. Hair could require enormous amounts of work. And the layers could make heat absolutely miserable. Imagine attending a crowded summer social event dressed in several layers of clothing while everyone politely pretends they're not sweating. Very elegant, very respectable, extremely warm. And yet the woman was expected to behave as though nothing was happening. No tugging at the dress, no complaining, no dramatic collapse onto the sofa, at least not in front of guests. She had to maintain composure, and that word comes up again and again. Composure. A wealthy Victorian woman could be experiencing almost anything internally and still be expected to look calm, which makes portraits from the period rather amusing. Everyone looks incredibly serious, but perhaps the expression isn't sadness. Perhaps she's simply wearing 17 pounds of clothing and trying not to move. And there were other beauty practices. Hair was extremely important. A woman's hairstyle could take significant time. Long hair could be arranged, braided, pinned, curled, decorated, and supplemented. Hair pieces and extensions could help create fashionable styles. And again, the lady's maid was involved. She wasn't just a servant, she was partly a stylist, partly a dresser, partly a personal assistant, and occasionally, probably a therapist. Because when someone spends an hour standing behind you manipulating your hair, eventually you're going to tell them things. And the maid listens. She may not offer advice, but she hears. This is another reason servants could become so important in women's private lives. The physical intimacy of dressing creates opportunities for conversation. The mistress can't exactly run away while someone is fastening the back of her dress, so she talks about the dinner, the husband, the children, the mother-in-law, the upcoming visit, the dressmaker, the letter that arrived yesterday. And sometimes, the man she wasn't supposed to be thinking about, the maid might say nothing. She might simply continue arranging the hair. But she now knows. And that's how secrets spread. Not dramatically, not through spies, through ordinary conversations during ordinary routines. The same could happen with cosmetics. Victorian women certainly cared about beauty. But the products and attitudes varied enormously throughout the period. There were creams, powders, lotions, perfumes, hair preparations, and countless commercial products promising to make women more beautiful. Some were relatively harmless, others were questionable, and some could contain substances we would now consider dangerous. The beauty industry was already discovering one of the oldest tricks in commerce. Convince someone they're defective, then sell them the solution. Your skin isn't perfect? Buy this. Your hair isn't fashionable? Buy this. Your complexion isn't pale enough? Buy this. You look tired? Absolutely don't admit that you're tired. Buy something. Because appearing healthy, delicate, elegant, and youthful could all be part of the expected feminine image. And wealthy women could spend considerable amounts maintaining it. But beauty also had another purpose. It communicated social status. A woman who could afford elaborate clothing, professional dressmakers, expensive jewelry, and servants to maintain her appearance was displaying wealth. You didn't need to say, "I am rich." Your clothes were saying it for you. Your house was saying it. Your jewelry was saying it. Your carriage was saying it. Even the number of servants helping you get dressed was saying it. Which meant fashion wasn't simply vanity. It was social communication. And wealthy Victorian women understood that extremely well. They knew what different colors suggested, what styles were fashionable, what was appropriate for mourning, what was appropriate for morning calls, what was appropriate for dinner, what was appropriate for a ball, what was appropriate for church. And getting it wrong could be embarrassing. Imagine arriving at an event and realizing your dress is completely inappropriate. You can't exactly pull out your phone and order another one. You're stuck for the rest of the evening. And everyone notices. So women became experts in these social codes. But there was another interesting part of appearance, mimicking wealth. Because not everyone who looked wealthy actually was. Fashion could create the appearance of status, and wealthy women were very aware of people trying to imitate them. This produced endless anxiety about taste. Was something elegant? Or was it trying too hard? Was it fashionable? Or was it vulgar? Was it expensive? Or did it merely look expensive? Victorian society could spend an astonishing amount of time answering these questions, and women were often judged particularly harshly. A man could wear the wrong thing and people might laugh. A woman could wear the wrong thing and suddenly everyone had a theory about her character. Too flashy, too plain, too young, too old, too fashionable, not fashionable enough, too much jewelry. Not enough jewelry. The correct amount of Victorian femininity apparently required a mathematical formula, and wealthy women knew the formula, or at least they tried to. But beneath all of this was something far more personal: the body. Victorian women were expected to present a very specific physical ideal, and yet their real bodies were doing real things. Periods, pregnancies, childbirth, illness, aging, weight changes, scars, pain. And none of these things fit neatly into the polished image, so they were hidden, covered, managed, discussed privately, and sometimes simply endured. A wealthy woman might have access to better clothing and better medical care than most women, but she was still living inside the same human body, and that body did not care about Victorian etiquette. It would get sick, it would sweat, it would bleed, it would hurt, it would become pregnant, it would age. And eventually, it would refuse to cooperate with the social performance. This is why beauty could become exhausting. because maintaining the appearance required constant attention. And the more important your social position, the more pressure there could be to maintain it. Your husband might not know how much effort went into the finished appearance. He might simply see the final result. A beautiful woman entering the room, hair perfect, dress perfect, jewelry perfect, smile perfect, and perhaps he never saw what happened beforehand. The pins, the adjustments, the discomfort, the frustration, the maid running around looking for something that had disappeared, and the woman herself standing there thinking, if one more person asks me whether I'm enjoying myself, I'm gonna scream. But she doesn't scream. She smiles. Because that's what respectable women did. And that smile becomes another kind of secret. Because the person everyone sees isn't necessarily the person who exists privately. And nowhere was that difference more obvious than at the social events where wealthy Victorian women were expected to perform happiness for hours. Dinners, balls, afternoon calls, country house weekends, charitable events, weddings, funerals, and endless gatherings where everyone was supposed to be charming, which raises an important question. What happened when a woman simply didn't want to be there? Well, she had to find a way to survive the evening without letting anyone know. And that brings us to the exhausting social world of wealthy Victorian women, where one badly chosen sentence could create a scandal that lasted for years. Now, if you thought wealthy Victorian women spent their days sitting around drinking tea and looking elegant, well, they did drink tea. But they were also participating in an exhausting social system where almost every interaction had rules. And breaking the rules could make people talk. You had to know when to visit someone, how long to stay, what to wear, what to bring, what to say, what not to say, and, perhaps most importantly, when to leave. Because overstaying a visit was apparently a minor social crime. Imagine being told, please come for afternoon tea. You arrive. You sit down. You talk. You drink. And then you have to somehow determine the precise moment when your continued presence has become annoying. Too early? Rude? Too late? Also rude? Perfect timing? Congratulations, you have successfully completed Victorian social mathematics, and wealthy women were expected to be extremely good at it. They had to maintain relationships constantly. A visit here, a letter there, an invitation, a thank you note, a condolence message, a birthday greeting, a wedding gift, a small social obligation that somehow creates 3 more social obligations. And ignoring one could be interpreted as a deliberate insult, which meant social life could become exhausting, because you weren't simply seeing people when you wanted to see them. You were maintaining a network, and that network mattered. Your husband's political connections might matter. Your family's connections mattered. Your children's future connections mattered. Your own friendships mattered. And every social interaction could potentially create an advantage, or a problem. This is why wealthy Victorian women could become experts at polite hostility. Because you couldn't simply say, I don't like you. You had to communicate dislike while remaining perfectly respectable. Perhaps the visit becomes shorter. The invitations become less frequent. The replies become slower. The tone becomes slightly colder. And eventually, you simply stop appearing. Nobody officially announces that the friendship has ended. It just quietly dies. Very civilized. Very British. And sometimes the opposite happened. A woman you actually liked could become extremely important to your social life. You might invite her to dinner, visit her home, introduce her to people, recommend her to others, and slowly she becomes part of your circle. But circles had boundaries, and those boundaries could be fiercely protected because class mattered, money mattered, family background mattered, religion could matter, political opinions could matter, and marriage mattered enormously. A woman might be perfectly pleasant, but if her family was considered socially inappropriate, she might never become a close friend. This is one of the uncomfortable realities of elite Victorian society. It wasn't simply about being rich. It was about being the right kind of rich. Old money could be treated differently from newly acquired wealth. A titled family could be treated differently from a wealthy business family. Someone could have enormous amounts of money and still be considered socially inferior, which meant wealthy women were constantly evaluating one another, and they were being evaluated in return. Your house, your clothes, your manners, your husband, your children, your servants, your dinner parties, your relatives. Everything could become evidence. And this made social gatherings a little like walking into an examination you hadn't studied for. Except the examiners were other wealthy women, and they were sitting directly across from you. Now imagine a dinner party. The table is beautifully arranged. The silver is polished. The candles are burning. Everyone is dressed perfectly. The conversation begins. And somebody makes a political comment. You disagree. What do? You cannot launch into a passionate argument. Not if you want to remain respectable. So you say something like, "How very interesting," which could mean, "I completely disagree with you and think your opinion is ridiculous." But everyone smiles, and dinner continues. This kind of indirect communication was everywhere. People rarely said exactly what they meant, especially when social consequences were involved. And wealthy women became extremely skilled at reading those signals. A pause, a glance, a particular tone, a carefully chosen word, a missing invitation, a sudden change in someone's behavior. All of these could communicate something. And because everyone was doing it, everyone was also constantly interpreting everyone else, which could make social life exhausting. Because you're not just having a conversation, you're analyzing the conversation. You're wondering what they meant. You're wondering what they think you meant. You're wondering who heard it. And you're wondering whether somebody's going to repeat it later. And yes, they probably are. Because gossip was one of the great social currencies of the period. But gossip wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was simply information. Who was getting married? Who had become ill? Who was expecting a baby? Who was traveling? Who had lost money? Who had moved? Who had died? Who was looking for a governess? Who had a new cook? Who had dismissed their butler? These details mattered because wealthy households were interconnected. One family's servant could move to another. One family's daughter could marry into another. One family's financial trouble could affect another. And everyone wanted to know what was happening. But then there was the darker kind of gossip. Scandal. And scandal was different. Because scandal could destroy reputations. A rumor about an affair. A financial problem. A pregnancy outside marriage. A gambling addiction. A family dispute. A servant who had left under mysterious circumstances. Anything could become a story. And once a story entered the social network, it was very difficult to retrieve. You couldn't simply post a correction. You couldn't delete the original rumor. You couldn't turn off comments. The rumor moved through people, and people added details. By the time it reached the fifth person, it might barely resemble reality. But that didn't matter. People enjoyed the story. And wealthy women knew how dangerous this could be. So they learned to control information. Don't confirm. Don't deny too much. Don't react dramatically. Don't give people material. And above all, don't look nervous, because nervousness attracts attention. If someone asks, "Is everything all right?" and you immediately say, "Yes, absolutely! Nothing is wrong! Congratulations!" You've just told them something is wrong. The better response was probably something like, "Of course! Why do you ask?" And now the question goes back to them. Very elegant, very dangerous, very Victorian. But social life wasn't only about avoiding scandal. It could also be genuinely enjoyable. Women attended dances, music evenings, dinner parties, theater performances, picnics, country house gatherings. They played games, talked, flirted, dressed beautifully, and formed friendships. The mistake is imagining Victorian society as one endless funeral. People laughed, they joked, they enjoyed themselves. They could be playful, they could be ridiculous. They could make fun of one another, and wealthy women could have enormous amounts of fun when they were surrounded by people they trusted. But the moment a stranger entered the room, the performance could begin again. And there was another performance that mattered enormously. Marriage. A wealthy woman's marriage was not simply her private relationship. It was a social institution. People watched it, people judged it, and if the marriage looked unhappy, people noticed. But there was a strange expectation. You didn't necessarily have to be happy. You had to look married properly. You had to attend events together, appear affectionate enough, support one another publicly, avoid obvious conflict, and maintain the appearance of stability. A couple could be miserable privately and perfectly successful socially. This is one reason the phrase happy marriage can be difficult to interpret historically. A marriage could contain affection and resentment at the same time. Love and frustration, companionship and loneliness, financial security and emotional distance. People aren't simple. Marriage wasn't simple either. And wealthy women had another reason to maintain appearances. Their children. because children were constantly being watched too. Their behavior reflected on the parents. Their education mattered. Their manners mattered. Their clothes mattered. Their friendships mattered. And wealthy mothers could become deeply involved in managing all of this. A son was being prepared for adulthood. A daughter was being prepared for marriage and social life. And the mother was expected to guide them, which could create another enormous source of stress, because your child's future could affect the entire family. A bad marriage, a scandal, a financial mistake, a rebellious child. Any of these could become a family crisis. So wealthy Victorian women could spend enormous amounts of time managing their children's lives, and sometimes they had to do it while pretending everything was perfectly calm. Imagine your daughter has just announced that she's in love with someone your family considers completely unsuitable. You smile, you pour tea, you say, "How very sweet," and internally, absolutely not. Then you begin planning. Who can speak to her? Who can speak to him? Can the engagement be delayed? Can the family intervene? Can another marriage be suggested? Can she be persuaded? And suddenly the mother becomes a strategist. Not because she wants to control every aspect of her daughter's life, but because marriage was too important to leave entirely to romance. At least, that's what many Victorian parents believed. And wealthy families had another concern. Inheritance. Who would receive what? Which child? Under what conditions? What happens if someone dies? What happens if a marriage fails? What happens if a son spends everything? What happens if a daughter becomes widowed? These questions could sit quietly beneath family conversations. Nobody mentions them at dinner, but everyone knows they matter. And women could be deeply involved in these discussions, especially mothers managing the future of their children. So behind the beautiful social world, there was a huge amount of calculation. Who should marry whom? Who should be invited? Who should meet whom? Who could be trusted? Who was financially secure? Who was socially respectable? Who had the right connections? And who should absolutely not be allowed near your daughter? This is why wealthy Victorian women could be far more strategic than the stereotype suggests. They didn't necessarily have official authority, but they had information, they had relationships, they had social influence, and they knew how to use both. Sometimes quietly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through a single sentence spoken over tea. And if you were particularly good at it, nobody even realized you had made the decision. They simply thought everything had happened naturally. Which brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable part of wealthy Victorian marriage. Because beneath all the etiquette, all the dresses, all the dinner parties, and all the beautiful houses, there was one question that could determine a woman's entire future. What happened if she wanted to leave? And for a wealthy Victorian woman, the answer was much more complicated than simply walking out the front door. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about wealthy Victorian women managing husbands, households, servants, friendships, money, appearances, and approximately 17 different layers of clothing. But eventually, we have to ask the uncomfortable question: what if the marriage itself was the problem? Because marriage was supposed to be permanent. At least, that was the ideal. You married. You stayed married. You endured. You maintained the household. You raised the children. And if things went badly, you were generally expected to make the best of it. Which sounds wonderfully simple until you remember that husbands and wives were actual human beings. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they drifted apart. Sometimes one person became cruel. Sometimes there was infidelity. Sometimes there were financial disasters. Sometimes there was violence. Sometimes the marriage simply became two people living in the same enormous house and avoiding one another as efficiently as possible. And for a wealthy woman, leaving wasn't necessarily easy. The law surrounding marriage and divorce changed considerably during the Victorian period. The Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 was an important turning point in England because it created a civil divorce court system. But divorce did not suddenly become simple. It remained socially difficult, expensive, complicated, and heavily shaped by gender expectations. For a woman, proving serious marital wrongdoing could be particularly important. The standards were not symmetrical. A husband's adultery alone could be treated differently from a wife's adultery. And if you were a wealthy woman contemplating divorce, you weren't simply thinking, do I still love him? You were thinking, what happens to my children? What happens to my money? What will my family say? Where will I live? Will people stop inviting me places? What will happen to my reputation? Will my children be affected? And perhaps the most terrifying question, can I actually afford to leave? Because wealth doesn't automatically mean financial independence. A woman could live in a huge house and still have very little practical control over her future. She could have servants, jewelry, beautiful clothing, a carriage, a prestigious family, and still be trapped in an unhappy marriage, which is one of the strangest contradictions of wealth. The house can be enormous, while your options are tiny. And sometimes women tried to find alternatives: a legal separation, living apart, returning to their parents, spending long periods away, using separate residences, or simply creating a marriage that was technically intact but emotionally divided. A couple could remain husband and wife on paper while living almost entirely separate lives. And society might accept it as long as everyone behaved properly. This was the great Victorian talent, making enormous problems look invisible. The marriage is collapsing? Dinner at 8. The husband is cheating? Still send the invitations. The wife is miserable? She'll be at the charity event on Thursday? The family is having a financial crisis? Smile for the photograph. Nothing to see here. Please admire the flowers. But some women did fight. They consulted lawyers. They spoke to relatives. They gathered evidence. They sought financial support. They tried to protect their children. And sometimes they took the enormous social risk of separation or divorce. For a wealthy woman, the family itself could become a battlefield. Her parents might support her, or they might tell her to return to her husband. Her brothers might intervene. Her husband's family might pressure her. Friends might choose sides. Servants might know what happened. And lawyers could become deeply involved. Suddenly, the private problems of a marriage were becoming documents. Letters, statements, financial records, witness testimony. And once that happened, the private marriage could become public. That was one of the greatest dangers, because wealthy Victorian society depended heavily on appearances. If your marriage was privately miserable, that could be managed. If the details became public, much harder. People could gossip. Newspapers could report sensational cases. Friends could distance themselves. Family members could become furious. And children could become caught in the middle. So a woman might decide that an imperfect marriage was preferable to a public scandal. Not because she was happy, because the alternative was worse. And then there was the issue of children. For a wealthy mother, children were not simply emotional attachments. They were also part of the family's future. A separation could affect where children lived, who raised them, who controlled them, who paid for them, and what relationship they had with each parent. This could make leaving extraordinarily painful. Imagine being unhappy with your husband, but knowing that leaving might mean losing daily access to your children. That changes the calculation completely. And this is why some women endured marriages that outsiders might assume they could easily escape. From the outside, she's rich. Why doesn't she just leave? Inside the marriage, because leaving could cost me everything. Money, children, family, social position, security, and perhaps even the identity she had spent her entire adult life building. So sometimes the answer wasn't divorce. It was distance. A woman could spend more time with her parents, travel, visit friends, stay at a country house, focus on charity, focus on children, build an independent social world, and gradually create a life that required less and less interaction with her husband. They might still appear together when necessary, at weddings, funerals, major dinners, family occasions, photographs. But privately, they might barely speak, and the servants would know. Of course they would know. The husband sleeps in one room. The wife sleeps in another. They dine separately. They travel separately. They have separate social schedules, and eventually everyone in the household understands what is happening. Nobody announces it. Nobody needs to. The silence says everything. And sometimes that silence could last for decades. Now, there were also women who found something else: widowhood. And strangely enough, widowhood could provide some women with freedoms that marriage did not. Not immediately. The death of a husband could be devastating, emotionally, financially, socially, especially if the woman had children. But a widow could sometimes gain more control over her own household. She might manage property, make decisions, control aspects of family life. And, depending on her financial circumstances and legal arrangements, she could have greater independence than she had possessed as a married woman. Of course, Victorian widowhood came with its own rules. Mourning could be elaborate. Clothing became darker. Social expectations changed, and a respectable widow was expected to demonstrate grief. But there was an interesting contradiction. A married woman was defined partly through her husband. A widow could begin to exist socially as her own person, and some women embraced that. They traveled, managed estates, raised children, ran charities, managed finances, built social networks, and sometimes became more powerful after their husbands died, which tells us something important. The problem wasn't necessarily that wealthy women lacked intelligence or ability. The problem was often who society allowed them to exercise that ability through. Give the woman responsibility, and many were perfectly capable of handling it. But marriage could place limits on how that responsibility was recognized. Widowhood sometimes removed some of those limits, and that could be liberating. It could also be terrifying, because now there was nobody else to blame. If the estate had financial problems, they were yours. If the children needed decisions, you made them. If the servants misbehaved, you handled it. If the bills arrived, you dealt with them. Suddenly, the woman who had been treated as delicate was expected to manage an enormous amount of practical reality, and many did, very successfully. This is one reason the stereotype of the helpless Victorian rich woman doesn't really hold up. A woman could be socially constrained and still be extraordinarily competent. She could manage a household of dozens of people, organize events, handle correspondence, coordinate servants, raise children, manage charities, deal with family problems, and maintain a public reputation. That's not helpless. That's management. And occasionally, it's management under absolutely ridiculous conditions. But there was one final problem. What if she simply wanted a life that wasn't centered around marriage at all? Because not every wealthy Victorian woman wanted her entire identity to be wife, mother, hostess. And some women began pushing against those expectations. They became writers, artists, reformers, philanthropists, campaigners, educators, travelers, intellectuals, and their lives show us something important. Victorian womanhood was not one single experience. There were enormous differences between women, rich and poor, married and unmarried, young and old, urban and rural, widowed and single. Women experienced the period differently, but wealthy married women had one particular advantage. They had resources, and resources could create choices. Not unlimited choices, but choices. And sometimes those choices were used quietly. A woman didn't have to stand on a stage and announce, "I reject Victorian society!" She could simply start doing something else. Support a cause, fund an institution, write a book, manage her own property, build a network, travel, raise her children differently, or quietly create a life that belonged to her. And that brings us to the final secret. Because we've talked about what wealthy Victorian women hid from their husbands. Their money, their friendships, their health, their frustrations, their ambitions, their attractions, their private opinions. But there was something even bigger they could hide, something that sat underneath all of it, what they actually wanted from life. And once you understand that, the perfectly dressed Victorian woman standing beside her husband starts to look very different. Now, after everything we've talked about, the money, the marriage, the servants, the doctors, the friendships, the clothes, the gossip, the social rules, there's one question we haven't really asked. What did she actually want? Because it's very easy to look at a wealthy Victorian woman and assume the answer. She wanted a nice house, a successful husband, beautiful children, fine clothes, a respectable social position, and perhaps a peaceful afternoon with a cup of tea. And yes, some women genuinely wanted exactly that. But other women wanted something else, something much harder to explain, a life that felt like it belonged to them. And that could mean very different things. For one woman, it might mean controlling her own money. For another, it might mean spending more time with her children. For another, it might mean escaping an unhappy marriage. For another, it might mean writing, traveling, studying, painting, supporting a cause, running a charity, or simply having a room where nobody bothered her for an hour. That last one may actually have been the most realistic Victorian dream, because privacy was precious. Imagine having servants, children, guests, relatives, neighbors, a husband, and social obligations. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone needs something. Everyone has an opinion. And you are expected to remain pleasant. So perhaps the greatest luxury wasn't another diamond. It was closing a door, sitting down, and being completely alone. And wealthy women could sometimes create that privacy. A private sitting room, a writing desk, a bedroom, a garden, a library, somewhere they could read, write, think, or simply do absolutely nothing. And doing nothing could itself be a form of freedom, because the Victorian ideal of femininity demanded usefulness. A woman should manage the home, care for the children, maintain social relationships, support charitable causes, look presentable, be emotionally supportive, and somehow remain cheerful while doing all of it. So if a woman wanted an afternoon where she did none of those things, she needed a reason. I have a headache. I need to rest. I have correspondence. I have an appointment. And perhaps she did. But perhaps what she really needed was silence. That is one of the things that can disappear when we look at historical women through the polished image left behind by portraits. The portrait shows the dress, the jewelry, the expression, the social status. It doesn't show the thoughts, and those thoughts could be surprisingly complicated. A woman could love her children and desperately need a break from them. She could love her husband and still be frustrated by him. She could enjoy wealth and hate the expectations attached to it. She could appreciate beauty and be exhausted by maintaining it. She could value respectability and still privately think some of its rules were ridiculous. And that contradiction is important, because people don't have to completely reject a society to dislike parts of it. A wealthy Victorian woman could participate in the system while quietly negotiating with it. She could follow the rules when they benefited her, ignore them when she could, and bend them when necessary. Sometimes the bending was tiny. A private letter, a secret donation, a friendship her husband disliked, a financial arrangement, a decision about her children, a book she wasn't expected to read, a cause she wasn't expected to support, a conversation she wasn't supposed to have. But tiny acts accumulate, and over time, they can create a surprisingly independent life. This is especially visible in women who became involved in philanthropy. At first glance, charity seems completely conventional. A wealthy woman helping the poor? Very respectable. But look more closely. She now has a reason to leave the house. She meets people outside her immediate family. She organizes money. She builds networks. She learns about institutions. She corresponds with other influential people. She develops expertise. And eventually, people start coming to her for decisions. That changes things, because suddenly she's not simply somebody's wife. She's the person who knows how the organization works. She knows who needs help. She knows where the money goes. She knows which people can be trusted. And she has her own network. That can become power. Quiet power. Respectable power. The kind of power that doesn't require shouting. And women could use similar strategies in intellectual life. Reading was one. A woman could cultivate knowledge privately. She could read history, literature, science, politics, religion, philosophy. And although there were limits on formal education for women, wealthy families could provide tutors, books, travel, and other educational opportunities. Some women became extraordinarily well educated, and sometimes their husbands underestimated just how much they knew, which could be useful, because being underestimated is a surprisingly convenient position. People tell you things. They don't expect you to understand the details. They assume you're simply being polite. Meanwhile, you've been paying attention. And then there was writing. A woman could write diaries, letters, essays, novels, poetry. And writing provided something society couldn't completely control. Your private thoughts could exist somewhere outside your immediate social world. Even if nobody else ever saw them, a diary could become a place to say, I hated this. I was furious. I was frightened. I wanted something different. And perhaps the most important sentence, nobody knows I feel this way. That is the real secret behind many historical lives. Not that people were constantly committing scandals, but that they had private thoughts they never expressed publicly. And wealthy Victorian women were no exception. They could have entire emotional lives hidden behind perfect manners. And sometimes those private thoughts involved ambition. Not necessarily political ambition. Sometimes it was simply the desire to be taken seriously, to create something, to make decisions, to have influence, to be remembered for something other than who they married. Because imagine being introduced for your entire adult life as Mrs. Someone. Your identity is attached to your husband, his title, his family, his profession, his social position. And yet you are still an individual. You have your own interests, your own abilities, your own memories, your own ideas. Of course, you'd occasionally wonder, what about me? And that question becomes especially powerful when we look at older Victorian women. Because as a woman aged, the social expectations could change. Young women were watched for marriage. Married women were watched for motherhood and respectability. Widows could gain a different kind of independence. And older women could sometimes become the senior figures within family networks. The woman who once had to obey her mother-in-law eventually became the mother-in-law. And suddenly, she had opinions. Lots of opinions. She could influence her children, her grandchildren, family marriages, household decisions, and perhaps she became the person younger women came to for advice, which means the private knowledge passed from one generation to another, mother to daughter, sister to sister, friend to friend, maid to mistress. And sometimes the most important information wasn't written in any official history. It was simply remembered. Don't trust that doctor. Don't marry that man. Save some money. Keep your letters. Never tell everyone your business. Make sure you have somewhere to go. These are small pieces of advice, but they reveal something enormous. Women understood that appearances weren't everything. They understood that marriages could fail. Money could disappear. People could gossip. Husbands could disappoint. Health could collapse. And life could change suddenly. So they prepared. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes secretly. And that preparation could look very ordinary. Keeping important papers, maintaining friendships, saving money, building relationships with relatives, learning how the household worked, knowing the servants, understanding the family finances. These weren't dramatic acts of rebellion. They were survival skills. And perhaps that's the best way to understand the hidden lives of wealthy Victorian women. They weren't all secretly plotting to overthrow society. Most weren't. They were living inside a system. They understood its rules. They knew its limitations. And they learned how to maneuver within it. Sometimes they accepted the rules. Sometimes they challenged them. Sometimes they ignored them. And sometimes they simply found a quiet corner where the rules couldn't reach. That might be the most interesting part, because history loves dramatic rebellion. The woman who runs away. The woman who scandalizes society. The woman who openly defies her family. Those stories are easy to remember. But there was another kind of resistance. Quiet resistance. A woman choosing her own friends. Managing her own money. Protecting her children. Reading what she wanted. Supporting causes she cared about. Writing what she really thought. Maintaining a private correspondence. Or simply refusing to let her entire identity disappear inside her husband's. Those things may look small, but for someone living under strict expectations, small freedoms could matter enormously. And eventually, the Victorian world began changing, slowly, painfully, unevenly. Women gained more legal rights, educational opportunities expanded, professional possibilities increased, married women's property rights changed, attitudes toward women's roles began shifting. And the woman entering the Victorian era in 1837 lived in a very different world from the woman leaving it in 1901. The transformation wasn't complete, not even close, but something had changed. The private world was becoming harder to contain. Women were writing more publicly, organizing, campaigning, studying, working, speaking, publishing, and demanding recognition. The woman who once had to hide her ambitions behind a polite smile could increasingly say, "Actually, I want something." And perhaps that's the final secret. The wealthy Victorian woman wasn't simply the elegant figure sitting beside her husband in a portrait. She was a person negotiating an enormous system. Sometimes she was obedient, sometimes manipulative, sometimes generous, sometimes selfish, sometimes deeply loving, sometimes profoundly unhappy. And sometimes she simply wanted everyone to leave her alone. Because beneath the corset, the silk dress, the jewelry, the etiquette, the servants, the money, and the enormous house, there was still just a human being. And that human being had secrets. Some were scandalous. Some were practical. Some were romantic. Some were painful. And some were wonderfully ordinary. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to complain. She wanted to be understood. She wanted to have choices. She wanted people she could trust. And occasionally, she wanted to shut the door, take off the ridiculous dress, and finally breathe. Now, After all those beautiful houses, expensive dresses, carefully managed marriages, private letters, awkward dinner parties, and servants who somehow knew absolutely everything, we've reached the part where the Victorian woman disappears from the room. Not literally, just historically. Because for most women, the things they kept private were never recorded. And that's probably the strangest thing about studying their lives. We know what they were supposed to be. We know what etiquette books told them to do. We know what doctors wrote about them. We know what newspapers said about respectable women. We know what husbands wrote. We know what politicians believed. But what did the woman herself think? Sometimes we simply don't know. And that's because privacy leaves very little evidence. A secret that was successfully kept is, by definition, difficult to find. There is no document saying, "Here is the thing I successfully hid." There's just silence. A missing letter. A carefully worded diary entry. A sentence that suddenly becomes vague. A relationship that historians can see existed, but can't completely explain. And this is where history becomes fascinating, because sometimes the absence of information tells us something too. If a woman constantly writes about her household but never mentions a particular subject, perhaps she didn't want to write about it. If she suddenly stops writing about someone, perhaps something changed. If correspondence becomes unusually careful, perhaps someone else was reading it. We can't always know, and we shouldn't pretend that we can, but we can recognize the world these women lived in, a world where privacy mattered, where reputation mattered, and where being caught saying the wrong thing could have consequences. So women learned to be careful. They used euphemisms. They used initials. They changed subjects. They destroyed letters. They trusted particular friends. They kept certain conversations verbal. And sometimes they simply said nothing. Silence can be a survival strategy, especially when the cost of speaking is high. And wealthy Victorian women had plenty of reasons to remain silent. A family scandal could affect everyone. A husband's reputation could affect the children. A financial problem could damage social standing. A romantic relationship could destroy a marriage. A medical problem could become gossip. A disagreement with relatives could become a permanent family feud. So silence wasn't necessarily weakness. Sometimes it was calculation. Sometimes it was kindness. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was simply exhaustion. And sometimes a woman didn't want anyone else knowing because it was her business. That may be the simplest explanation of all. She had a private life, and she wanted it private. This is particularly important when looking at wealthy Victorian women because their lives could appear extraordinarily public. Their clothes were public. Their homes were public. Their marriages were discussed. Their children were discussed. Their social appearances were discussed. Their charity work was discussed. Their family names were known. But public visibility doesn't mean personal transparency. You can be famous in your social circle and still keep enormous parts of yourself hidden. And perhaps that's why the title of this entire story is slightly misleading. What did rich Victorian women never tell their husbands? Sometimes nothing dramatic at all. They didn't tell them every thought, every frustration, every conversation, every friendship, every worry, every financial concern, every private ambition, every little thing that happened during the day. Because marriage doesn't mean two people become one brain. It means two people remain two people. And the Victorian obsession with respectable marriage could sometimes make that distinction even more important. The husband was supposed to be the head of the household. The wife was supposed to support him. But supporting someone isn't the same as telling them everything. And that's where the private world could survive. A woman could smile at breakfast and think something completely different. She could attend dinner and remember something nobody else knew. She could write a letter and say what she really thought. She could sit with her closest friend and finally stop pretending. And then, when the evening ended, she could return to her room, close the door, and become herself again. Perhaps that is why bedrooms, writing desks, gardens, libraries, and private sitting rooms appear so often in stories about wealthy Victorian women. They were spaces where the performance could stop, the dress could come off, the jewelry could come off, the smile could disappear, and the person underneath could finally breathe. Of course, not every woman had a miserable secret life. That would be just as inaccurate as imagining them all perfectly happy. Some women genuinely loved their husbands. Some had wonderful marriages. Some adored motherhood. Some loved hosting parties. Some enjoyed fashion. Some loved their social position. Some were perfectly comfortable with the expectations placed on them, and some were not. History becomes much more interesting when we allow both possibilities, because the wealthy Victorian woman wasn't one character. She was millions of different people living through a long and complicated period. Some were conservative. Some were adventurous. Some were ambitious. Some were shy. Some were funny. Some were difficult. Some were kind, some were selfish, some were brilliant, some were ordinary, just like everyone else. And perhaps the biggest mistake we can make is assuming that because society expected women to behave a certain way, they all felt the same way about it. They didn't. People adapt differently. Some accept, some resist, some quietly escape, and some simply learn the rules well enough to use them. That last group can be particularly fascinating, because the woman who knows exactly how society works can sometimes manipulate it without appearing to. She knows what people expect, so she gives them exactly that, while doing something completely different underneath. She appears respectable. She behaves properly. She attends the right events. She wears the right clothes. She smiles at the right people. And then she goes home and makes her own decisions. No dramatic rebellion. No public scandal. Just control. And perhaps that was one of the most useful skills a wealthy Victorian woman could develop. Not being invisible. Being unremarkable. Because the less suspicious you appear, the more freedom you may have. If everyone thinks you're perfectly conventional, nobody spends much time investigating what you're actually doing. And that could create a surprisingly large private world. A woman could have her own correspondence, her own friends, her own charitable interests, her own intellectual interests, her own opinions, and perhaps her own little secrets, all while remaining completely respectable. And this is where the image of Victorian society becomes much more interesting. Because underneath the rigid rules, there was flexibility. People found loopholes. They negotiated. They adapted. They created private arrangements. They developed coded language. They found sympathetic friends. They built networks. They made exceptions. And women were often extremely good at it. Not because they were secretly plotting against men, but because every society teaches its members how to survive within its rules. And Victorian women learned those rules from childhood. They knew what could be said, what couldn't, who could be trusted, who couldn't, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to smile, when to leave, and when to pretend they hadn't noticed something. That final skill may have been extremely useful, because Victorian society ran on people pretending not to notice things. The husband doesn't notice the wife is furious. The wife doesn't notice the husband came home late. The family doesn't notice the financial problem. The servants don't notice the argument. The guests don't notice the awkward silence. Everyone notices. Nobody says anything. And somehow, the evening continues. That is the strange magic of respectability. It doesn't necessarily remove problems. It teaches people how to hide them. And once you understand that, the Victorian dinner table looks completely different. The smiling couple isn't necessarily happy. The quiet woman isn't necessarily passive. The elegant dress isn't necessarily comfortable. The wealthy household isn't necessarily peaceful. And the perfectly respectable lady may have an entire private universe that nobody at the table knows exists. Which brings us to the final question. After everything we've uncovered, were wealthy Victorian women really trapped? Sometimes. Were they completely powerless? No. Were they secretly living wildly scandalous lives? Some were. Most probably weren't. Were they happy? Some were. Some weren't. And were they all hiding enormous secrets from their husbands? Definitely not. But they were hiding something. Parts of themselves. And that's much more ordinary and much more human. Because every person has thoughts they don't share, things they don't explain, memories they keep private, and parts of themselves that belong only to them. Victorian women were no different. The difference was that their society gave them particularly strong reasons to keep those private parts hidden. So perhaps the real secret isn't what these women never told their husbands. Perhaps the real secret is how much of their lives existed completely outside the version of themselves that society was allowed to see. And once you realize that that elegant woman in the old photograph stops looking so distant, you can almost imagine her stepping away from the portrait, walking upstairs, closing the bedroom door, taking off the gloves, sitting down at her desk, and finally writing what she actually thinks. Because for a few minutes, nobody is watching, and nobody is listening. And so, after all the rules, the money, the marriage, the servants, the letters, the friendships, the clothes, the gossip, and the carefully maintained appearance of a perfectly respectable life, we arrive at the simplest secret of all. She was still a person. Not a wife first. Not a mother first. Not a wealthy lady first. A person. And there were parts of that person that belonged to nobody else. Not her husband. Not her family. Not her servants. Not society. Just her. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe a friendship. Maybe a private ambition. Maybe a disappointment she never talked about. Maybe someone she once loved. Maybe something she regretted. Maybe a dream she never had the courage to pursue. Or maybe it was nothing dramatic at all. Maybe she simply liked sitting alone with a book. Maybe she hated dinner parties. Maybe she loved terrible jokes. Maybe she secretly preferred a simple dress to the expensive one everyone admired. Maybe she found her husband's friends unbearable. Maybe she adored one particular servant. Maybe she laughed much louder when nobody important was around. These tiny things rarely make it into history, but they are what make a life feel like a life. And perhaps that is why the private world of wealthy Victorian women is so fascinating. The public version was polished, controlled, elegant, almost perfect. But behind that version was a woman improvising her way through ordinary human problems. She had good days, bad days, boring days, embarrassing days, wonderful days, and days when she probably wanted to crawl back into bed and tell everyone to go away. The Victorian period didn't eliminate those feelings. It simply taught people to hide them beautifully. And perhaps that's the image worth leaving with. Not the woman standing stiffly in a portrait. Not the enormous house. Not the silver. Not the servants. Not the beautiful dress. But the woman after everyone else is gone. The house is quiet. The candles are low. The last guest has left. Her husband is somewhere else. The servants are finishing downstairs. And finally, she has a moment to herself. She takes off the jewelry, unpins her hair, changes out of the dress, sits at her desk, and for the first time all day, she doesn't have to perform. Nobody needs her to smile. Nobody needs her to entertain. Nobody needs her to be charming. Nobody needs her to be respectable. She can simply exist. And perhaps she opens a letter from a friend. Perhaps she writes one of her own. Perhaps she records something she would never say aloud. Perhaps she thinks about the future. Perhaps she thinks about the past. Or perhaps she just stares out the window for a while. Because after spending an entire day being watched, sometimes the greatest luxury is being unseen. And that may be the quietest secret wealthy Victorian women kept from their husbands. Not necessarily an affair. Not necessarily hidden money. Not necessarily some enormous scandal. Just this. There was always more of her than anyone else could see. And maybe that's true of all of us. We present one version of ourselves to the world, another to our friends, another to our families. And then there is the version that exists when nobody is looking. The Victorian woman had that version too. She simply had more reasons to protect it. So when you look at those old photographs, the serious faces, the elaborate dresses, the stiff poses, try not to imagine people who had no sense of humor, no private desires, and no inner lives. Imagine someone who had just spent 20 minutes arguing with a servant about a missing glove. Someone who was secretly annoyed with her husband. Someone who couldn't wait to tell her sister what happened at dinner. Someone who had a book hidden under another book. Someone who had a friend she trusted completely. Someone who was worried about her children. Someone who was thinking about money. Someone who was in love. Someone who was lonely. Someone who was perfectly happy. Someone who was simply tired. In other words, someone human. And perhaps that is the best way to understand the secret lives of rich Victorian women. They weren't mysterious because they were fundamentally different from us. They were mysterious because we usually only get to see the version they were willing to show. The rest was private. And once the door closed, it belonged to them. So if you're still awake after all that, you can finally stop worrying about Victorian etiquette. No more dinner invitations. No more polite smiles. No more pretending to enjoy conversations with people you secretly can't stand. No more corsets. No more social calls. No more carefully worded letters. Just a quiet room, a closed door. And the comforting thought that somewhere, more than a century ago, another exhausted human being probably wanted exactly the same thing. A little privacy. A little peace. And nobody asking her to explain herself. Good night.